Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Welcome. My name is Jean Balance, and I'll be serving as a technical moderator in the background for today's upcoming Internet seminar. You should be joining us for the U.S. EPA webinar on new international requirements for exports and imports of plastic scrap. Our live broadcast is scheduled to begin in just a few moments at 2 p.m. Eastern. We have opened up a preliminary audio stream just a few moments early to allow our participants time to hop on and get connected. Again, we do anticipate starting today's upcoming broadcast of the U.S. EPA webinar on new international requirements for exports and imports of plastic scrap in just a moment. Audio is available online by default for all participants. That means you should be able to hear my voice coming through your computer speakers or with a pair of headphones. You should also find additional controls on the right side of your screen, which will allow you to enable closed captioning and open up a Q&A window. I'll encourage you, if you've connected early, please open up that Q&A window, and please feel free to send in a message to let me know how the audio and visuals are coming through. That Q&A window is a private submission, so anything you type in will be private, shown only to the organizers and presenters. So again, I'll welcome those of you who are connecting for today's upcoming U.S. EPA webinar on new international requirements for exports and imports of plastic scrap, and welcome those of you who have connected early to please use the Q&A window on the lower right of your screen to send in messages and let us know how the audio and visuals are coming through at your location. So I wanted to check with our first speaker and one of the organizers of this event, Leah, to see if it's okay if I begin with some opening instructions. Leah, can I start?
Yes, thank you, Jean.
All right, with that, I will officially welcome everyone to the U.S. EPA webinar on new international requirements for exports and imports of plastic scrap. Our session has been hosted by EPA's Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery. We'll be joined by two presenters from that office. Again, I'll be serving as a technical moderator in the background. My name is Jean Balance, and I'm here to assist with anyone who needs technical help today as well. Before we start with the official presentation content, let me walk through just a few quick housekeeping items to make sure that everyone understands how to participate. We'll be hosting today's broadcast using a new platform, Microsoft Live Meetings. You can participate using any web browser of your choice or the Microsoft Teams app, so you'll be able to watch and listen right through the web browser of your choice. We do strongly encourage, though, that you disconnect from any remote or VPN networks. They can sometimes degrade the quality of the broadcast. So again, please be sure to disconnect and then join the online session. Audio will be available online using your computer speakers or your headphones. So again, I encourage you to locally adjust your volume settings if you have any problems with that audio. For those of you who have connected, I would love it if you could take advantage of some controls in the lower right of your screen, which will allow you to turn on or off captions, as well as to open up a Q&A panel that you can pop out on the right side. I encourage you to keep that Q&A panel open throughout our broadcast, because you can use that space to privately submit comments, questions, and report technical difficulties at any time. Now, we'll walk through our presentation materials first, and then we'll pause for a Q&A break at the end. But there's no need to wait for a Q&A break to type in your questions. You can send them in at any point in time, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can in the time that we have allotted today. So for those of you who have connected, I would greatly appreciate it if you could open up that Q&A window now, and please send in a test message. Feel free to say hello, let us know how the audio and visuals are coming through, anything that you like, and type it in and then hit the enter key. And then again, we'll privately reply to acknowledge that you sent those messages in. So visually on the screen, this is what you'll be seeing here today. Again, a large area on the left where you can view the presentation content. That Q&A panel can be popped out on the right, and you can be sending in your questions with your name, or you can mark it as anonymous and privately send messages in as well. And then we do have those additional controls on the right to enable live closed captioning, as well as adjust playback speed. So with those very brief set of basic instructions and a number of messages coming in from people saying hello, confirming that they can hear and see things, I think we are ready to officially start today's session. So again, I just wanted to welcome everyone to today's new international requirements for exports and imports of plastic scrap. I'm going to read a brief description of our session and then get ready to switch it over to our presenters for today's session. So again, our webinar will explain the new international requirements for exports and imports of plastic recyclables or scrap. So in May 2019, 187 countries decided to significantly restrict international trade in plastic scrap and waste to help address the improper disposal of plastic waste and reduce its leakage into the environment. As a result of these changes adopted under a treaty called the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Waste and Their Disposal, international shipments of most plastic scrap and waste will be allowed only with the prior written consent of the importing country and any transit countries effective January 1, 2021. So the new Basel provisions will significantly limit the market for U.S. plastic recyclables because of a provision under the Basel Convention that prohibits trade between countries that have ratified the convention and non-party countries like the United States. Basel parties will not be able to trade most plastic scrap and waste with the United States absent a separate agreement between the countries that meet certain Basel criteria. So the United States has one such agreement that addresses trade in non-hazardous plastic scrap with member countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the webinar will discuss how plastic scrap is covered under that agreement. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenters. I'll ask my first speaker, Leah Johannes, to open up or turn on her screen, and then we'll go ahead and officially begin today's presentation. And so, Leah, if you'd like to come off of mute and just let me know whenever you're ready to turn on screen share.
Yes, I am trying to do that now. And as I'm doing that, I got a message that I hadn't seen before. So let me know if you can see my screen now.
I can see your screen now, so you can feel free to go right on in, and you are live.
Okay, thank you, Jean. And thank you all for joining us for this EPA webinar, where my colleague Rick Bacardi and I will be explaining some of the recent changes to the international requirements for exporting and importing plastic recyclables that Jean just highlighted. My name is Leah Johannes, and I'll be covering the first half of the presentation. So many of you may already be aware of the recent decision made under the Basel Convention to change the requirements for exports and imports of plastic recyclables or scrap. Because this decision brings significant changes to the way exports and imports of plastic scrap will be regulated globally, during this webinar, we'll be explaining what the new requirements are and what some of the key impacts will be on U.S. exporters and importers. So this slide jumps right into the key takeaway message, which is that starting on January 1, 2021, exports of most plastic scrap will be significantly restricted by most countries under a treaty called the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and Their Disposal. As a result of these changes, it will become illegal under the Basel Convention for most countries to import the majority of plastic scrap from the U.S., and this includes major importing countries for U.S. plastic scrap currently, such as India, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Thailand. Before going further, I just want to provide some brief background on the Basel Convention itself. So the Basel Convention is a legally binding treaty which establishes a prior notice and consent process for transboundary movements of wastes covered by the convention. This basically means that exports are only allowed after the proposed importing country provides written consent. And I'll talk a little bit more about what's involved in the process in a second. So waste subject to these Basel requirements include primarily hazardous waste, but also some non-hazardous waste. Currently, this includes municipal solid waste, or MSW, as well as incinerator ash from the combustion of MSW. The convention entered into force in 1992, and currently 187 countries are parties. Its main objective is to control and ensure the environmentally sound management of primarily hazardous wastes subject to transboundary movement. The US is a signatory to Basel and has participated in the convention as an observer since the beginning, but the US is not a party. So under the Basel Convention, Basel control wastes, in other words, wastes that are regulated under the convention and are subject to its requirements, can only be exported once the exporting country receives written consent from the importing and any transit countries. This slide provides a quick rundown of the key steps involved in this process. So first, in order to export a waste covered under the convention, the exporter submits a notice to the exporting country government. In the US, EPA is the competent authority responsible for managing this process. And in other countries, the function is also usually managed by the environmental agency or ministry. Two, the exporting country government then forwards the notice to the proposed importing country government, who then reviews the notice and either consents, objects, or conditionally consents to the notice and informs the exporting country government. The exporting country government then informs the exporter of the decision of the proposed importing country government. And finally, if consent was received, that generally means that the exporter has approval to export the waste or wastes for 1 year, up to a year, under the conditions of the consent and or import permit. And so while the US isn't a party to the Basel Convention, exports and imports of wastes regulated as hazardous waste under the US Resource Conservation Recovery Act are subject to prior notice of consent through this process I just described, in addition to other tracking requirements. And we'll touch base on some of these requirements towards the end of the webinar. So now bringing us back to the new Basel Convention requirements for transboundary movements of plastic scrap. So in May of last year, Basel parties decided to newly require exports of most plastic scrap to be subject to the Basel Convention prior notice and consent requirements I just explained, starting on January 1, 2021. These changes are referred to as the Basel Convention Plastic Waste Amendments. So parties to the convention adopted the amendments as a way to address marine plastic litter. Out of concern about the problem stemming from the mismanagement of plastic waste, or imported plastic waste in particular, and the impacts improper disposal was having on the marine environment. Prior to these changes, plastic scrap was generally considered outside the scope of the convention, in other words, not subject to Basel requirements for export. In terms of the big picture impacts to the US, we anticipate the impacts to be pretty dramatic because Basel parties aren't allowed to trade in Basel controlled waste with non-parties like the US unless a separate bilateral or multilateral agreement is in place that meets certain Basel criteria. And this is because of a long-standing provision under the convention, which is known as the party-non-party trade prohibition. And so as a result, it will be considered illegal for most parties, for most countries, I should say, to import and export plastic scrap with the US unless a separate agreement is in place. And Rick will be talking about one of these agreements during the second half of the webinar. So now I'm going to go into a little bit of background to explain the context that led to the adoption of the amendments. So in the years leading up to the proposal to amend the convention to address plastic waste, there were significant shifts in global trade flows of plastic scrap to countries where residual waste from plastic recycling wasn't always managed in an environmentally sound manner. For decades and until as recently as 2016, China imported about half of all plastic scrap exported globally for recycling. And I know that, this information is probably very familiar territory to a lot of you. That changed when China implemented strict import restrictions on recyclables, including plastic scrap, beginning in 2017. Plastics that had been destined for China then started to be imported by other countries, especially in Southeast Asia. I really like how this graphic helps tell the story pretty succinctly, and so I'll walk us through it here. So basically, what we're seeing here is a dramatic shift in export flows between the first quarters of 2017 on the left and 2018 on the right. So China and Hong Kong in blue go from importing the largest quantities of plastic scrap to importing much lower volumes. And other Asian countries, especially Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam in yellow, start importing much more than before. So concerns grew about the capacity of these newer major importing countries to recycle plastic in an environmentally sound manner and properly dispose of the residual waste generated from recycling. And so to help address these concerns, Basel parties proposed adding export controls to transboundary movements of most plastic scrap. So from here on out, I'll be talking about what the specific changes are. So the new Basel provisions classify plastic scrap into what I'll be referring to as 3 categories, establishing new listings for plastic scrap and waste in the 3 Basel Convention annexes where scrap and wastes are identified and listed in the convention. So the first category covers most non-hazardous plastic scrap and waste in Basel Annex 2, which is where a list of wastes that require special consideration are listed. So MSW and incinerator ash from the combustion of MSW I mentioned before. So this material will be subject to Basel Convention prior notice and consent requirements. The second category covers plastic waste classified as hazardous waste under the convention. And will also be subject to Basel requirements. And so these wastes are listed in Basel Annex 8, which contains the list of hazardous waste controlled by the convention. And finally, the third category covers a small subset of non-hazardous plastic scrap. This material will not be subject to Basel requirements for export, and this listing is found in Basel Annex 9, which lists the non-hazardous waste and scrap not subject to Basel requirements. And so because of the longstanding party-non-party trade prohibition I mentioned before, Basel parties won't be allowed to trade with the U.S. in the plastic scrap and waste falling under the first and second categories described above, except under a separate agreement between countries. And we'll be talking about one such agreement later in the webinar. So this slide gives an overview of some of the key changes and new rules that will apply to exports of plastic scrap under these amendments. And because of how the amendments are structured in the convention, it's helpful to first describe the types of plastic scrap not subject to Basel requirements before describing the types of scrap and waste, plastic scrap and waste that will be subject to requirements. And so exports basically must meet a pretty narrow and strict set of criteria to be classified as not subject to Basel requirements under that third category. In general, material must be pre-sorted and clean, in other words, free from contamination, and be destined for environmentally sound recycling, and fall under one of 4 main groupings. So either 1, plastic scrap almost exclusively consisting of 1 non-halogenated polymer. So these include the most common plastic recyclables, comprising bottles, containers, etc. For example, polymers of polyethylene, polypropylene, PET, and also include copolymer plastics such as ABS, which are commonly used in electronics and car parts. The second main grouping is plastic scrap almost exclusively consisting of 1 cured resin or condensation product. So these are mostly thermoset plastics. So an example is epoxy resins, which are commonly used in hard plastics. The third general category is plastic scrap almost exclusively consisting of one of a limited number of fluorinated polymers. Oh, and I should say that, almost exclusively is in quotes because that's terminology taken directly from the amendments. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then the fourth main grouping is mixed plastic scrap, consisting of polyethylene, polypropylene, and or PET that's sent for separate recycling of each material. So those are the only mixed plastics, mixed plastic scrap that is allowed under kind of exempted from Basel requirements. And so this category of plastics is described in the new Basel listing, which has a code of B3011 in Basel Annex 9. And it replaces the current listing for plastic scrap and waste in the Basel Convention, which has the code of B3010. And so basically the changes take a pretty broad listing, which is exempt or not subject to Basel requirements in B3010, and makes it much more narrow in B3011. And so exports not meeting these criteria would be subject to the party-non-party trade prohibition. So the plastic scrap and waste that doesn't meet the criteria again of the third category will be covered by either the first or second category and would be subject to Basel requirements. And so the first category covers most non-hazardous plastic scrap and waste, including plastic scrap that is contaminated, for example, with food residue and or other wastes, plastic scrap mixed with other types of scrap, paper, metal, plastic scrap containing halogenated polymers, an example would be PVC scrap, and then any mixed plastic scrap except for the shipments containing any of the three polymers I mentioned previously, so polyethylene, polypropylene, or PET, and that those would have to meet the criteria I mentioned previously in the Basel listing B3011. And so all of this material is described in the new Basel listing with code Y48 in Basel Annex 2. And then the second category covers hazardous plastic scrap and waste, which is defined as plastic scrap and waste containing or contaminated with hazardous constituents. And those are listed in Annex 1 of the Basel Convention. To an extent that waste exhibits a hazardous characteristic, and hazardous characteristics are listed in Annex 3 of the Basel Convention, and there are about 14 Basel characteristics in total. And so this waste is described in new Basel listing 83210 in Basel Annex 8. So many questions remain about how the terms used in the new Basel waste listings will be defined. Here we've got in bolded text the undefined terms, just for reference. So, and to summarize the requirements, to be classified as not subject, plastic scrap must generally be almost exclusively of one non-halogenated polymer, resin, or one of a limited number of fluorinated polymers, be almost free from contamination from other types of waste, and be destined for recycling in an environmentally sound manner. And so some questions we have include, how will the terms almost exclusively and almost free from contamination from other types of waste be defined? What will be considered contamination or contaminants? Will this include non-recyclable material like food residues, stones, dirt, etc.? Will it include recyclable non-plastic scrap like paper and metals? It's our understanding that yes, but it hasn't. There's still a lot of ambiguity there. What level of contamination or mixing will be considered acceptable? And will the acceptable level of contamination differ by the type of contaminant? So these are some of the questions that we have on those terms. And then, like I mentioned before, clean mixed plastic scrap consisting of PE, PP, or PET is allowed if destined for separate recycling of each material. And that term is also yet to be defined, or that phrase. And so it's expected that Basel parties will work to try to provide clarity on these terms. And EPA is participating in the Basel groups that are likely to address some of these questions. But we don't have, any answers at this time. And so this slide helps visualize the three categories of plastic scrap and waste covered by the amendments. You can think of the amendments as a pie with three slices. And all three slices together cover all end-of-life plastics. So the three slices are the green on the far left, and then the brown and orange on the right. So on the left in green is the Basel B3011 listing. That's the material that's not subject to notice consent. So primarily clean, single, non-halogenated polymers sent for recycling in an environmentally sound manner. And then on the other end, in orange, is the Basel A3210 hazardous plastic waste listing. So waste that contain a Annex 1 hazardous constituent and exhibit an Annex 3 hazardous characteristic. And then in brown are all the plastic scrap and waste that isn't covered by either of those two listings. So that includes most mixed plastic scrap and waste, plastic scrap and waste that's contaminated, and which contains halogenated polymers like PVC scrap. And then in the middle are some of the remaining questions about whether or how certain waste or scrap streams may be covered by the new Basel listings. So some questions we have are, will all end-of-life products consisting of different polymers be controlled? For example, auto parts that are made of different materials like polycarbonate and ABS plastic. And what about scrap containing some contamination, like PET bottles with their labels, or that contain some food residues? And then what about end-of-life products that contain some plastic but consist predominantly of non-plastic material? Will they be controlled under the new Basel Y48 listing? So an example here would be office furniture, like hard plastic chairs that are made up of, plastic and steel. So that's basically an overview of the amendments, the Basel Plastic Waste Amendments, and the requirements that apply, and a highlight of some of the key questions that remain. I'll now turn it over to Rick to talk through the new international requirements that apply to transboundary movements of plastic scrap and waste under another international agreement that governs exports and imports of primarily hazardous waste for recovery.
Hey, thank you, Leah. So there are two major international agreements that control the import and export of scrap and waste. Leah talked about the Basel Treaty. The other is an agreement called the OECD Council Decision. And OECD stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a consortium of democratic, mostly affluent countries, 36 countries around the world. The reason there's two agreements is that since these are wealthier countries, they wanted a more streamlined process or wanted to have the option of a more streamlined process for imports and exports. And so this agreement allows that. So that's the reason you've got two agreements. One of the advantages for us in the US is that we're a member of the OECD. So Leah had talked about earlier where you're allowed to have agreements under the Basel Convention, which kind of, parallel the Basel Convention. And the Basel Treaty is broken up into sections called articles, and it's Article 11. And you can have what's called an Article 11 agreement, which allows country to import and export, sort of separate from Basel, but kind of in parallel with Basel. And the OECD Council decision is one of those agreements. And so that's a real advantage to us because in the Basel Convention, as Leah mentioned, there is a party non-party prohibition. So if you're a Basel party, sort of i.e. a member of the Basel Convention, you're not supposed to be trading with countries that are not a party to the convention. And since we're the US is not a party to the convention, a lot of countries cannot trade with us normally under Basel, but because we have this what's called a Basel Article 11 agreement, this OECD Council decision, we can trade with these 36 countries. Now it's just for recovery, but that covers a lot of material. So that it's been very helpful for us. So as you can see here, we traded 581 metric tons of plastic scrap with OECD countries last year, valued at almost $300 million. So it's not inconsequential. And over half of our trade in plastic scrap is with other OECD countries. I know some of you are probably aware that, we've got a fair amount going to South Asian and East Asian countries, some of which are OECD countries, but most of them are not. But and that is significant, but we also have a significant trade with other OECD countries. So one of the things that, because we have two major agreements controlling imports and exports, we ran into an issue in the late 90s. All of the OECD member countries had ratified the Basel Convention and become parties or members, like I said, by the late 90s, but the US had not. And what that meant is that all these other countries in the OECD had to follow the Basel import-export procedures as well as the OECD import-export procedures. And while those procedures were very similar, they weren't quite the same. And so countries were having to go through the same set of procedure, two sets of procedures for for the same export. And so countries wanted to harmonize the Basel Convention Agreement and the OECD Council Decision Agreement as much as possible. And we did that in the late 90s, early 2000s. We harmonized the procedure, and we also harmonized the waste listings as much as possible. Leah was talking about Basel Annex 9, which is non-hazardous waste, not covered by the convention. The OECD, that's the OECD Green List. Leah had talked about the Basel Annex 8, which is the Basel hazardous waste, hazardous scrap and waste. In the OECD, that's the OECD Amber List. And so those lists were harmonized as much as possible. Annex 9 with the Green List, and Annex 8 with the Amber List. In the agreement, there was some concern that those waste lists, as they were changed over time, because you end up adding to them or modifying them, that the Basel and the OECD waste lists would drift apart over time, and countries wanted to prevent that from happening. So what we all agreed to was, if folks want to have a change to the waste listings, let's do it through the Basel Convention because that's global. Covers the, essentially almost the whole world. And so if there's a change in the Basel Convention, the Basel waste listings, those waste listing changes are automatically incorporated into the OECD waste listing. So if somebody added a Basel Annex 8 waste in the Basel Convention area, that would be automatically incorporated in the OECD Amber List, unless a country objects. So we go to the next slide. And so for 20 years, there has been changes to the Basel waste listings, Annex 8 and Annex 9, and no one has ever objected. Everyone's fine with those waste listing changes. There was agreement that made sense. So as Leah had discussed last May in 2019, the Basel parties made a dramatic change, and we went from a situation where virtually no plastic was considered hazardous and Basel covered, and essentially all non-hazardous plastic scrap was not covered in Basel. To change it to that most non-hazardous plastic scrap was now covered by Basel, and prior notice and consent was required. And that was a really dramatic change. And part of what was driving that is that the concern over marine litter. So if you're getting plastic scrap for recycling, probably most of what you're getting is recyclable, but there's some of it, including some plastics that aren't recyclable, and they're, what we sometimes refer to as residual waste. And so in some of the developing countries, some of the poorer countries, that residual waste was either getting burned or dumped. And if it was getting dumped, then it can wash into waterways. It can wash into a stream and go from a stream to a creek to a river and an ocean, 500 miles away, and end up as marine litter in our oceans. And so the idea is that if countries in Basel, if countries had more control over what was coming into their country, they could lessen the imports and exports that resulted in those residual waste, which were a marine litter issue. In the US, we just didn't feel that made sense for the OECD, because the OECD is wealthier countries. It's like the US, Canada, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, some other countries, Mexico included. And the vast majority of those countries are really good at dealing with residual waste. It's either landfilled, or it goes for waste to energy, or a facility that's got good emissions controls. So we didn't feel that it made sense to incorporate the Basel plastic scrap amendments into the OECD. It just wasn't a fit for the situation in the OECD countries. And we were concerned that it would unnecessarily lessen recycling. In the OECD countries, we don't feel that there should be restrictions on the movement of non-hazardous plastic scrap. We want the plastic scrap to be able to move to where it's needed for, when folks need materials and they're making new products, to increase the overall level of recycling. Once you start requiring prior notice of consent for non-hazardous plastic scrap, then you're adding costs, which lowers the value of the material. It makes it a little harder for that material to get to the end market, sort of, and it takes it longer for it to get to the end market, which can be a problem sometimes. Manufacturers need materials at a certain time, and they need predictability there. And so for a number of reasons, we did not want restrictions in the OECD on the movement of non-hazardous plastic scrap. We just didn't think it really made sense from an environmental or economic reasons. And because we objected last July, what that did was trigger a negotiation process in the OECD. So if we're not going to apply the Basel Plastic Scrap Amendments, basically, what are we going to apply? How are we going to control the imports and exports of plastic scrap, and sort of what plastic scrap are we going to control and what plastic scrap aren't we going to control? Next slide, please. So basically, that negotiation process started last July and went until June of this year. And it was a very difficult negotiation process. The countries were pretty far apart. There were some countries that wanted to apply the Basel Scrap Amendments in the OECD. And then you had countries like the US where it's like, well, if a plastic is hazardous, then we should control it. We should apply notice and consent. But if it's not hazardous, we should let it move freely to increase the overall level of recycling. And there were countries all in between those two ends of the spectrum. And we never really got to a place where we could reach agreement. But one thing we could reach agreement on is that hazardous plastic scrap should be subject to notice and consent. And how hazardous plastic scrap is defined is if you contain a hazardous constituent in Appendix 1 of the OECD Council decision, and we have links later in this presentation. There's URLs that have links that you can go see the Council decision, and you can go look at the OECD Council decision appendices. But if you've got a hazardous constituent listed in Appendix 1 and a plastic scrap that exhibits a hazardous characteristic listed in Appendix 2, then you're considered a hazardous plastic scrap under the OECD Council decision, and notice and consent would be required for imports and exports. For those of you who are familiar with the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, or better known as RCRA, we've got some hazardous characteristics there, like toxicity, reactivity, corrosivity. So you've got more or less got those in Basel and the OECD as well. But some of the other hazardous characteristics are like ecotox, is another example. There's both the OECD and Basel have a broader range of characteristics than what we have in RCRA, which I think is relevant in the case of plastics. Now, in terms of non-hazardous plastic scrap, we could not, that's really the area where the OECD countries could not reach agreement, did not get close to reaching agreement on what non-hazardous plastic scrap to control in terms of imports and exports, and how to control it, which I was unfortunate, but it is what it is. I mean, plastic is a hot potato issue these days, and it's just hard to get all the countries on the same page. So what the situation we're left with is that individual OECD countries will be applying sort of the procedures and covering the scope of non-hazardous plastic scrap that they feel is appropriate, which I think makes it very challenging for importers and exporters. So it's going to be case by case. So, if there's an import and export between the US and other OECD countries, the importers and exporters are going to have to find out how what requirements that other country is applying. Next slide, please. So, the individual countries, as I said, are going to apply different approaches, and one of them is and this is what the U.S. prefers, is what we call the status quo interpretation. What we think we have been doing in the OECD for 20 years has been working. Generally, non-hazardous plastic scrap moves without prior notice and consent. Unfortunately, we didn't have any other OECD country, including some of our close allies, who agreed with that entirely. They wanted something, somewhat different. They wanted some non-hazardous plastic scrap to be covered. And so I think we're going to see that. And one of the things we're going to see is that some of the OECD countries are going to say, okay, we are fine with, all non-hazardous plastic scrap being imported and exported. But we're going to want prior notice and consent for either some or, a good chunk of that non-hazardous plastic scrap imports and exports. And then that's, one set of approaches. Another set of approaches, and countries have said they're going to take this interpretation, is what's called an out-of-scope interpretation. And so those countries in the OECD are basically saying the OECD countries couldn't reach agreement on how to handle plastic scrap imports and exports in the OECD. Hence, the OECD Council decision doesn't cover those imports and exports, and instead the Basel Convention Treaty does. And because the US is not a party to the Basel Convention Treaty, they are not going to import and export with the United States. We don't entirely know who those countries are. I mean, it's still being sorted out, sort of what interpretations we're hoping to hear, by the end of the year, what interpretations OECD countries are going to take. We haven't really heard much so far, but we're, it's really starting to push to find out what those interpretations are. The last item here, so one of the things the U.S. pushed for in the OECD negotiations was to get a review clause. Because, we think we're going to implement the approach where individual countries decide what requirements they're going to apply. They're going to apply different requirements. I think it's going to be very challenging. And so what we wanted was a built-in opportunity for the OECD countries to revisit this in the future. It's like, okay, for a few years, we've tried with individual countries having different approaches to imports and exports. Do we want to try and negotiate again to try and come up with a single OECD set of procedures for the imports and exports of plastic scrap? And hopefully, and we agreed that 2024 would be the time that the OECD countries would consider that. And our hope is at that time that the countries will start another negotiation process and trying to come up with a single OECD approach to how to control non-hazardous plastic scrap. Next slide, please. So one of the things to keep in mind is while there's been, there's significant changes going on in international agreements on how they cover plastic scrap imports and exports, and there's significant changes in countries, individual countries on how they control plastic scrap imports and exports. How we control them domestically under our waste management law, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, has not changed. Those changes have not. They don't mean that RCRA changed. RCRA has not changed. We still have the same set of requirements on plastic scrap and waste that we've had. And talking a little bit about what some of those requirements are, if you have hazardous plastic scrap, which is possible, there is plastic where heavy metals are used as stabilizers. They could potentially fail the RCRA toxicity characteristic test. I mean, maybe they wouldn't, maybe they would. So it's possible under RCRA to have, hazardous plastic scrap. And if you are, hazardous, then there's certain requirements. And one of them is the prior notice and consent process, which Lee and I have been talking about. Another is if you've got an export, it's going through a transit country, you've got to provide notice and get consent from that transit country. And a transit country is just any country that a shipment is going through. And you see this more in Europe. I think a good example is if you've got some waste in Spain that's going to be sent to a waste management facility in Germany, likely it's going to go through France on the way to Germany. So it's transiting France, and so Spain would have to provide notice and get consent from France before the shipment could go to Germany. You know, because of our geography, transit countries aren't as much of an issue for the U.S., but they're still an issue. We still have, you know, we have imports and exports that where transit countries are involved. So it is still something to keep in mind. So the tracking requirements. So basically, for those of you who are familiar with the RCRA Hazardous Waste Manifest, it's a tracking document that follows the waste from the point of generation to its final disposal point, called cradle to grave tracking. Now, one of the things about RCRA, and this is true in a lot of countries, they've got domestic hazardous waste manifests like the RCRA Hazardous Waste Manifest, but in terms of international shipments, it's incomplete. If you've got an export, the RCRA manifest only applies in the US, and so you've got what's called cradle to border tracking. And for imports, you have what's called border to grave tracking. You don't have cradle to grave tracking for international shipments. And one of the things you have, you know, we've added to RCRA, and this is true around the world, there's a document called the movement document, which is essentially an international waste manifest. And so it allows for true cradle to grave tracking for international shipments. Something else that's a requirement are confirmations of receipt and confirmations of recovery. And that's if a scrap or waste that's regulated goes to a facility, receiving facility. That facility needs to confirm that it received it. And then they might store it for a couple of months before they recycle or recover it. And then once they do that, then they have to send a confirmation of recovery. And these here, notice, consent, transit countries, the movement document, and these two confirmations are pretty universal at this point. Almost all countries apply these in some form for, in a fairly consistent form, actually, for regulated waste transboundary movements. Just as a reminder, the majority of plastic scrap is not going to be hazardous waste under RCRA. It's a pretty small sliver, I think. And so, so most plastic scrap from the U.S. perspective most plastic scrap is not subject to RCRA import-export requirements. Could be subject to requirements from other countries, that we're trading with, but not subject to RCRA requirements. So something to keep in mind is that more and more countries are placing in prior notice and consent requirements on plastic scrap and waste, and more countries and more countries are broadening the scope of what they consider to be hazardous plastic. In the U.S., we're looking at a sliver of plastic that would be potentially hazardous. But some countries are looking, you see this particularly with brominated flame retardants, plastics with chlorinated flame retardants, plastics with heavy metals, looking at those as hazardous plastics. But they're even going beyond that, some of the countries, and they're looking at, okay, what other additives are in plastics? And deciding, are those hazardous? So I think this is a trend you're going to see, is you're going to see more and more countries cover a broader and broader range of plastics as hazardous. So I think that's something that's coming down the road. Something to keep in mind, and I've alluded to this, is that anytime there's an export, there's two countries involved. We might not regulate it in the US, but the other country might regulate it. And so you've got to comply with the regulations of both countries. It's not just the United States. So anytime you've got, an export, for example, you've got to find out what the country, the exporter would need to find out what are the requirements in the importing countries, what are they applying to make sure that they're in compliance with that, and the same with transit countries. Next slide, please. So I think many of you are aware, and probably all of you are aware of the China national sword restrictions of like 2017, 2018, where China severely restricted the scrap, including plastic scrap, that they were importing. So you just saw this tremendous decrease in the amount of plastic scrap that was imported, and had a dramatic effect on the scrap exports of the United States, a number of Western European countries, Japan, etc. So basically, in some form, one of our main messages here is that this is happening in a sense again. This is, because the marine litter issue is so important to so many countries, driving how folks look at plastics. And so what you're seeing is that the changes in the Basel Convention from last May 2019, where you're taking, non-hazardous plastic scrap, which was not regulated, under an international agreement, now is. It's a lot of that has become what's called Basel covered waste. Prior notice of consent is going to be required for a lot of non-hazardous plastic scrap. And because it's Basel covered waste and the US is not a party to the Basel Convention, and that non-party prohibition comes into effect, that if you've got Basel party countries that aren't members of the OECD, which is a lot of countries, that we're under Basel, we're not going to be able to export them. It's still legal under RCRA, but it's going to be illegal under Basel, and it's going to be illegal in that importing country. And as you can see in the chart there on the right, so the OECD countries are Canada, Mexico, South Korea, and Turkey. Now, I mean, we've been talking with Canada, we haven't worked things out. It looks like non-hazardous plastic scrap is going to move freely between us and Canada with little or no change. Mexico, South Korea, Turkey, we don't quite know yet, but we still could trade with them. They're OECD countries that fall under Basel Article 11 agreement, the OECD Council decision. Now, these other countries, India, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Taiwan, Thailand, and Indonesia, Vietnam is another one. They're not OECD countries. They're Basel parties that are not OECD countries. So the Basel party non-party prohibition applies. So after January 1st, under the Basel Convention, those countries shouldn't be taking plastic scrap exports that are covered, Basel covered, Y48, Basel Code Y48 that Leah talked about, which is a lot of non-hazardous plastic scrap. They shouldn't be taking those, they shouldn't be importing that from the United States. And Malaysia and to some extent Indonesia have already started pushing back on us and already started rejecting US plastic scrap shipments, even though the Basel January 1st requirements haven't even kicked in yet. So we're expecting after January 1st to start seeing some significant pushback from some of these Basel countries that are not OECD countries. And they're going to start rejecting US plastic scrap exports. So that's going to be a big issue. It's going to be a dramatic change. After China restricted its imports, you started seeing a lot more imports going to some of these other countries listed in this pie chart here, as well as Vietnam, and those countries are probably going to start pushing back. So what we saw with the China National Sword in 2017, we're gonna see something I think similarly dramatic in 2021 when it comes to plastic scrap. It sort of as a reminder, China, did it for virtually all scrap. I mean, what we're talking about here is plastic scrap, not the wide range of plastic scrap in China National Sword, but for plastic scrap, I think it's going to be, almost as dramatic a change. So as you can see, we've got quite a few exports. Last year we had 667 metric tons, worth $279 million. And then we imported almost 400,000 metric tons of plastic scrap valued at $226 million. So it's not inconsequential. But I asked you to look at the import chart. So, you can see we've got a lot on both the import chart and the export chart with Canada. But Mexico, which is another trading partner, we've got about four times as many imports from Mexico as we export to Mexico. So for Mexico, it's a little different. It's not the imports and exports aren't even. We're importing a lot more from them than we're exporting. So again, we don't really know how Mexico is going to want to control those plastic scrap imports and exports. They've made some noises about, they're going to want some prior notice and consent for non-hazardous plastic scrap, but we're not really entirely sure yet. So, all right. Well, thank you, Leah. That's it for me.
Thanks, Rick. I'm not sure if I'm still on mute.
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay.
Yep.
So thank you, Rick. So we're going to close it out with a couple more slides on some of the impacts that we anticipate once the changes take effect next year, and some factors that we offer up for you all to consider in planning for those impacts. Before I go further, I just want to say first that we recognize that state and local governments have already been dealing with some pretty significant changes already, resulting from a weaker export market for U.S. recyclables in general. And so, I realize that much of what I'm about to say about impacts is probably familiar territory, but, we just wanted to identify some of the key points that you might want to take into consideration, in terms of what the impacts might be on plastic recycling in your jurisdictions. So first, we think that there's going to be really a lot of confusion among the regulated community on what requirements apply and how to comply. There's the technical questions about the scope of waste that the new requirements apply to, what types of plastic scrap and waste are covered by the new amendments. But then also, questions about the procedural requirements that apply, that Rick talked about, prior notice of consent and the tracking requirements, the international movement documents, and the confirmations of receipt and recovery. It's going to be pretty challenging for the regulated community to learn all these new requirements, since these are folks, that are, generally dealing with non-hazardous scrap and waste. And so all this will be completely new to them, since, those requirements in the U.S. only apply to imports and exports of waste regulated as hazardous under RCRA. And then, we also anticipate there's going to be situations where we receive export notices from other countries, that want to send and export plastic scrap to the U.S. So they'll require a notice, even though, EPA doesn't regulate that material. And so because we don't regulate it, we'll issue what's called a neither consent nor object, which is essentially consent, but it'll be another step in the process for importing plastic scrap that's never happened before. And so there's, going to be time, involved in doing that administrative process that material, never previously had to go through. And so, as a resource and to help guide the regulated community, during the transition and beyond, we've developed a web page providing information about the new requirements with frequent questions and answers to guide exporters and importers on what they need to know and how to comply with the new requirements. And, we're doing outreach. So We include this in the slides for your reference. I encourage you to check that out. Okay, and so another major impact that we anticipate here, and that Rick already stressed, is a dramatic, curtailing of the market for U.S. plastic recyclables. And while it's true that we've already seen this with the implementation of China's strict import restrictions, and as Rick mentioned, what makes these changes different and potentially more dramatic for trade in plastic scrap is that these changes are pretty close to global. It really is almost all countries applying some very strict requirements collectively. And because of the party-non-party trade prohibition, it really will, impact U.S. prospects for trade in this material. And so, for you all, one factor to consider when thinking about the impact this will have on your state or municipality, is where the end markets are for plastic scrap that's collected in your community. And if the material is exported, our end markets OECD or non-OECD countries. And if it is non-OECD countries, then those export opportunities will probably no longer be available unless those exports meet the criteria described in the Basel B3011 listing, which are pretty restrictive. And so with respect to impacts on U.S. recycling programs, we're anticipating, significant adverse effects. Recycling programs have, previously benefited from the revenues from the sale of higher value plastic scrap exports. And, we recognize that those revenues have already significantly declined since, China and other Asian countries have already started to restrict, export the imports they take. But, these changes will, or these, the revenues will continue certainly to decline. And so, recycling programs won't be able to benefit as much from those revenue sources. And so we mentioned this just so you keep it in mind and, in your planning. Okay. And with exports a less viable option, we anticipate that there will continue to be more attention inward on the current state of plastic, processing capacity in the U.S. Some questions here to consider in planning for these changes include how to address factors that affect the composition and quality of plastic scrap, like contamination rates, keeping in mind the new Basel requirements, and whether it's economically viable to process plastics to meet those new Basel criteria. And finally, because all these changes, we'll see decreases in plastic recycling, or I should say U.S. exports for plastic recycling at least. And we're likely to see increases in landfilling of plastic scrap in the U.S. And so that's something to consider continuing planning for. The management of plastic scrap that was previously exported for recycling and that may not be economically viable to recycle in the short to medium term. That said, we know that the economics of plastic recycling vary across the country, and some areas are already seeing an increase in recycling infrastructure or investments in recycling infrastructure, while others are seeing more of an increase in landfilling. But overall, I think we're anticipating an increase in disposal, at least in the near to medium term. But to conclude, we do hope that all of these changes will eventually lead to more incentives to increase U.S. plastic processing capacity and to help make strides towards improving the U.S. recycling system overall. EPA recently released its draft national recycling strategy, which identifies ways to strengthen the U.S. recycling system. And so, if you're interested in learning more about that effort, I'm sure many of you are already aware, but here's a link where you can read the strategy and provide input. I believe comments are being solicited until December 4th. Rick and I are not directly involved in this effort since we focus on the international side of recycling and waste management issues, but our colleagues are working really hard, and it's it's something to keep in mind, and we encourage you to read more about it. And so with that, that brings us to the end of our presentation. But just, before we go into the resources, just some of the main takeaways that we hope you get from this webinar are that, one, we really anticipate some dramatic changes with the entry into force of these new rules starting January 1, 2021. We're going to see a lot of countries view imports of plastic recyclables from the U.S. as illegal traffic under the Basel Convention. And for the exports that are allowed, they're going to be subject to notice and consent requirements. And so as a result, movement of this material is going to slow down pretty significantly. And as a result of the changes, U.S. opportunities to export plastic recyclables are really going to suffer. And so it's a lot of bad news. And we're here to try and help make the transition as smooth as possible by providing the resources that folks need and the regulated community needs to be able to understand what the new requirements are and try and facilitate compliance. So with that, we have several resources if you want to learn more. The first set of links are EPA resources. At the top is a link to our new webpage explaining the Basel changes. Here we make our best attempt at explaining the new requirements in a straightforward way as possible, but it does get kind of complex. The second link connects you to detailed information about the RIC requirements for exporting and importing hazardous waste that Rick mentioned. And the third link provides information about international agreements, the Basel Convention, OECD Council decision, so the international agreements that govern transboundary movements of waste. And that's where you can find a copy of the Council decision if you want to read more about it. And the last couple of links are to Basel resources. So first, there's a copy of the Basel Plastic Waste Amendments themselves, and then information about the amendments from the Basel Convention website, including some frequent questions and answers. And so with that, I think we are ready for questions.
All right, thank you so very much. So I just wanted to remind the audience here that we're going to go ahead and go into our Q&A mode. And so bear with me while I swap out the live screen. And I'll just remind the audience that you have access to a Q&A panel. If you haven't opened it up, look in the upper right of your screen for a small Q&A icon. You'll be able to click that out and a window will pop out on the right side. You can be privately sending in comments and questions using that space. If you have no questions at this time, you can also enter that in as a message and send it. If you've already entered a question, I have them in the queue and I'm going to start with those. And again, I'll just remind everyone, keep those questions coming on in and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the time that we have remaining today. So this very first question goes back to what you all started with. Actually, a few people have asked for you to just clarify that the U.S. is not party to the Basel Convention or treaty. And then I have a follow-on, depending on the answer to that.
Yeah, thanks. So there's certain provisions in the Basel Convention Treaty that you have to have the legal authority to implement those provisions in order to ratify the convention and become a party, become a member of the Basel Convention. Now, the U.S. is a signatory, and for those of us in the international world, we know what that means. It sounds more significant than it really is. And actually, being a signatory doesn't mean much. It just means that you're agreeing to the text that was negotiated. And if you've been involved in negotiations, they'll go to 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning, and there's pieces of paper everywhere and printouts, and you think you know what you agreed to, but you're not entirely sure. Well, the international organization types it all up and puts it all together, and basically when you sign, you're saying, yes, that's the text I agreed to. What's much more important is called ratification, and that's how you become a party. And because you need to have legal authority to implement all the provisions of the treaty to ratify, we have not been able to do that. We have the legal authority for most of the Basel provisions, but there's a few that we don't have the legal authority for. One is there's certain wastes that are Basel covered wastes that we don't regulate at the federal level, that we would need to be able to require prior notice and consent for exports for those wastes. And an example is medical waste. We would need to be able to require prior notice and consent for medical waste for us to be a party, and we don't regulate medical waste at the federal level. So that keeps us from being a party. Now, the way medical waste is regulated domestically would not change. This would just, if we got the legal authority, became a Basel party, it would just apply to imports and exports. So that's an example. There are certain waste that are Basel covered waste that we would need to be able to cover that we're not able to. Another example is what's called returns. If there's sometimes a waste is shipped and it's not what the receiving facility thought they were going to get. And so, EPA under that scenario would need to be able to force the return of that shipment. In practice, it's often alternative management in another country or another facility. It wouldn't necessarily be brought back to the US, but we don't have that legal authority. And then the third gap in our legal authority is on transit notices. So under Basel, if you're sending, Basel covered scrap or waste through another country, then you're required to send a transit notice to that country and get a consent. I talked earlier about transit countries. And under RCRA, the US law, we can only require a transit notice if there's an import or an export. Well, it sounds like we're covered. We're not. And the reason we're not is because we have hazardous waste coming from Alaska that gets trucked through Canada to the US for the lower 48 states for management. It's not an import or an export. It's a US to US shipment, but yet it goes through another country. So under Basel, because it goes through another country, we have to do a transit notice. But under RCRA, we don't have the legal authority to require transit notice unless it's an import or an we can only require transit notice if it's an import or an export, which in Alaska, the lower 48 shipment is not. So that's the three legislative gaps. So we need to have those legislative gaps filled before we're in a position to ratify the Basel Convention. Thanks.
Thank you. And just a follow-on question, has the U.S.'s role in the convention changed at any point in time?
So we've never been a party. We've never ratified. We've never had the legal authority. So we've always been the official status for somebody who's not a party who participates in decisions on the international implementation of Basel as an observer. Leah mentioned that earlier. So we've always been an observer in international meetings, at Basel meetings where they talk about how to implement Basel.
All right. A number of people have asked if you could repeat when the changes will, quote, go live.
Yeah, so it's January 1st, 2021, and that's the changes for both Basel and OECD. The OECD, because it was harmonized with Basel, has their changes go into effect at the same time. So January 1st, 2021. Okay.
Now we have questions about the applicability in some background in determining this new rule. So one of the attendees wanted to know if you could talk about the metrics for deciding that non-hazardous plastic scrap does not meet or need requirements for import and export. They're just wondering if you could talk from an economic or environmental perspective.
So let me start on that, and I'll hand it over to Leah. So I think, unfortunately, we don't really have metrics, except for the Basel B3011 listing, where you can have PE and PPE and PET, et cetera, together. And then you're not a Basel covered waste. You don't have to do notice of consent. I think once you get beyond that, it starts getting fairly nebulous, and you've got all those terms that Leah talked about that have not yet been defined in terms of what they mean. So we're not really at a point of having metrics. And one of the things that to keep in mind is that usually in Basel, when you have a change like the plastic scrap amendments, the plastic scrap waste listing changes, it happens over a series of Basel meetings over 2 or 3 years. So those terms get defined along the way, or they're mostly defined. People have a pretty good grasp of them. People were so concerned, Basel countries were so concerned about marine litter that they drove through the plastic scrap changes in one Basel meeting. That's never happened before. While some countries are happy about that in terms of trying to address marine litter, it leaves us with this unfortunate circumstance of having a lot of undefined terms that will need to be defined in the next several years. So, Leah, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that is basically it. The terms to most pay attention to in that B3011 listing are, almost exclusively. So basically, plastic scrap really needs to be pre-sorted on the front end before export, so that it would be considered almost exclusively consisting of one of the 3 categories I talked about. So either a non-halogenated polymer, which are the common plastic recyclables that are used in, household products and drinking water bottles and that kind of thing, or almost exclusively of, one thermoset plastic, so the resins, epoxy resins, that's what's used in the hard plastics, or a limited number of the fluorinated polymers. And then the other term is almost free from contamination and from other wastes, which we interpret, since the term waste in the Basel context is also used to refer to scrap. So plastic scrap has to be free, basically, or almost free, a term that has not been defined, from contamination and not mixed with other types of waste or scrap. And then there's the very small allowance for mixed plastics, which are for, PET, so resin code number 1, polyethylene, so it's not defined whether it's high density or low density, so resin codes 2 or 4, and then polypropylene, resin code number 5. Also subject to certain terms in that Basel B3011 listing. So, but metrics, I think also, so there's in the Basel Convention context, countries could potentially agree to define the terms in a certain way, but it's also up to the discretion of each individual country to make sort of their own interpretations, and they can always be stricter or just take a different interpretation. So I think it will be interesting to see how universal implementation is, or how it may vary country by country come January 1 or into next year.
Okay. We do have a few questions again on the application. And so this next one asks, how would this new export restriction impact the management of plastics from those that are used in electronics, such as computers?
Leah, you want to answer that?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a good question. The B3011 listing, so the plastic that wouldn't be subject to Basel requirements or the party-non-party trade prohibition, specifies that plastics must be non-halogenated. So to the extent that, e-plastics or plastics used in electronics have, halogenated compounds, so brominated flame retardants or other flame retardants that are halogenated, that would mean that those plastics wouldn't be considered B3011 plastics. So they would either be covered under the Y48, so the non-hazardous plastic listing in Basel Annex 2, or considered hazardous plastic waste in the Basel Annex 8 of 83211 or 83210 Basel Code. So it could go either way. The hazardous classification or the hazardous listing is for wastes that contain an Annex 1 constituent, a hazardous constituent in Basel Annex 1, of which organohalogens are one, but then also exhibit a hazardous characteristic, which, toxicity is one of many. Rick mentioned several, but I would say, toxicity would be the one of most relevance for plastics. So to the extent that countries consider, e-plastics that contain halogenated compounds to be hazardous, they might classify it under that listing. So thank you for the question.
Okay. The next questioner states that there is a significant amount of plastic in mixed paper bales. And they note an Oregon's 2010 study found that our paper bales had about 1% plastic, and I've heard of even higher numbers elsewhere. They just note that this plastic seems to be just as harmful as the non-wanted plastics in the plastic bales. And they wondered, does Basel affect this plastic in exported paper bales?
So that's one question that we have, and that's a good question. I think you could ask that question about paper, which is a higher value, recyclable certainly today. You could ask the same question for metals. I think it sort of remains to be seen what will happen to recyclables that are exported that contain both plastics and some other non-plastic scrap. It could be that they are controlled under the Y48, the non-hazardous plastic waste listing that would be subject to Basel requirements, or it could be if the percentage is quite low, depending on how Basel parties come to terms with defining the terms. Maybe that 1% contamination rate might be below a threshold. It really does remain to be seen what will happen to end-of-life materials that contain plastic and non-plastic materials. And if that person has, additional follow-up questions, feel free to reach out.
Sure. There are some questions here about future actions or assistance as a result of these new rules. So one of the questioners asked, what will the U.S. be doing to improve local handling of plastic waste due to the lack of the ability to export now?
So that's a good question. Unfortunately, Leah and I are international folks working on the import-export side. So I'm not as familiar with what's happening domestic in terms of recycling. You might want to check the American recycling strategy, which Leah had showed in one of her slides to get some insight on that. But that's outside the scope of what Leah and I do. I don't know. Leah, you don't know anything about that, do you?
No, I would point folks to the national strategy, and there's the America Recycling Summit coming up too, where there's opportunities for public participation. So there's good resources, like you said, Rick, on our website about those efforts, which do include as some of the activities that have been identified as warranting further attention and dialogues with stakeholders are market development and infrastructure and processing capacity, and those are some of the issues that EPA is looking at in that context.
Okay. We've had a few people, again, asking similar questions if there's going to be any plans to expand the U.S. recycling capacity.
Certainly our colleagues are hoping that happens, and that's part of the goals of the American Recyclables Summit that EPA is having in November, is to try and boost the recycling capacity in the U.S. So yeah, it's sort of in line with what Leah is saying. If you read the America Recycle strategy and try and plug into the American Recycle Summit to get more insight into those kind of questions.
Okay, great. And the last content-related question that I have here is they want to know if you have any information on the U.S. end market and how it's going to be affected by these new international requirements. They go on to ask if you are anticipating any additional new manufacturing operations that might come on board in the next few years.
Well, certainly, at EPA, we welcome, plastic scrap imports. We think the movement of plastic scrap just increases recycling overall. So, hopefully we're not going to see a decrease in, plastic scrap imports for those who are getting, material from outside the United States. I think some changes we're seeing, and we've seen this with the China National Sword Program, and we might see it with the Basel changes after January 1st, is that some of the Chinese companies are actually buying, they're getting recycling facilities here, and they're converting the plastic into pellets for shipping to Chinese manufacturers. So we know that the Chinese are buying more pellets from the U.S. and they're actually buying facilities that convert the plastic into pellets. So we might see further changes in that area as well. How it would affect, I don't know, U.S. manufacturing, I'm really not sure.
Okay. So at this time, I don't see any new questions. I've seen a number of people note that they had no additional questions, a few thank yous for the information. A few people have questions about copies of the presentation materials, which I'll be happy to talk about before we close out today. But I don't see any additional questions in the queue. So what I wanted to check with Leah and Rick to see if there were any final thoughts they wanted to leave with the audience, and if one or two last questions sneak in while you're sharing those thoughts, we'll try to get those in before we close things out. So Leah, any final thoughts you want to leave the audience with?
None from my end. Rick, do you have any?
Yeah, I would say it's like China National Sword in 2017. I think we're gonna see a dramatic change here after January 1st. And while there was confusion because with the China National Sword because they made the changes without giving countries hardly any notice. I think in some ways what China did, while they didn't allow people much time, it was somewhat clear what China's requirements were with like 0.5% contamination, that kind of thing. I think we're also going to see a dramatic shift in plastic scrap imports and exports in January, but it's going to be messier even than what happened with China, just because there's so many terms that haven't been defined. Countries are approaching it in different ways, and we don't yet know how that is. And so I think all that's going to play out over the next year or two before we, I think, get into a more stable position. And there's going to be a lot of uncertainty for a couple of years.
All right, thank you so much, Rick. So at this time, I still do not have any additional questions that have come into the queue, and we are coming right up on that scheduled end time of 3:30 p.m. Eastern. So with that, I'll just echo your thanks. I want to thank both you and Leah for joining us and sharing your expertise. I want to thank all of our participants who signed in and listened and shared their questions and comments. And I do want to confirm, for those of you who are looking for copies of the presentation material, we did email a PDF copy with the instructions to join today, but we'll also be reaching out. The organizers will be sending a follow-up email later this week, which will include links to the resources that were highlighted, as well as copies of the presentation material for your reference. So we do encourage you to keep your eyes peeled for that email. If you had a colleague who wasn't able to join us live, but they registered, we will also include them on that follow-up email. So anyone who signed up will get the resources from today's talk. And so with that, I'm seeing a lot of thank you messages that are just popping in. People appreciated the conversation, and they hope that there'll be more in the future. So I think we'll go ahead and officially conclude today's live broadcast. I want to thank everybody for joining us. And again, we'll shut down today's session. So this is the formal conclusion for today's live seminar.